let's make sure everybody else is hearing me.
Yeah.
Here we go. Okay.
Great. Everyone says looking better, sounding good.
Okay.
Fernando is back.
All right, cool.
Okay, awesome. So I'm just recording now.
Sweet.
So brief intro, Neal Spackman, founder of the Baydha Project. All right, no intro. Let's get started with the presentation.
Cool. Thanks, Raleigh.
No worries.
Okay, so I'm just going to assume, let's go back to the beginning. When we're talking about culture, we're talking about really sensitive things. And when we're talking about foreign cultures, we're not necessarily talking about going to another country. Your PTA may be a foreign culture. The bowling club that meets, 3 miles away from where your house would be a foreign culture. Whenever we're going into organizations, any type of human organization is going to have its own kind of culture and its own kind of structures. And so what I want to show you today is my own framework for how I understand cultures, and then my methodology, or the way that I approached integrating myself into an Arabic Muslim nomadic culture in the desert south of Mecca. I am wearing a sprig of oregano on my shirt. This is a practice that a lot of the Bedouin have, is that when some things come up as a ground cover, they've got a number of plants that they like to adorn themselves with. So this is my reminder of the people that I'm going to be representing to you folks, and who are my friends and who have worked with me for the last 6 years. But I think this is really important because the way that we approach designing for land use or water use, like we know we have to look at geography, we have to look at climatic factors, we have to look at precipitation, we have to look at soil types. We have this framework in the regenerative agriculture movement for how we design land and water use or agricultural systems. But there isn't right now a dominant framework for doing that on people's systems. And one of the reasons for that is because culture is really hard to understand, but also because it's not nearly as solid as, say, looking at geography, right? You can't really do a contour map of human society. And so to the extent that we're looking for leverage points in the social strata of things, this is not going to be the be-all, end-all of this kind of conversation, but I do hope that it gets people thinking about the different frameworks that we can use to set up sustainable social systems that allow us to maintain sustainable land systems. Okay? The other thing I want to say about this, just starting off, is that when you talk about culture, it's almost inevitable that you're going to end up offending somebody because it is such a sensitive topic, and it's really hard not to speak in stereotypes. So I'm going to treat this as gingerly as I can, and as sensitively as I know how, and as respectfully as I know how. With that being in mind, and with that in mind, the way that I like to look at this is through a series of, I'm going to bring it up right now. Here we go. Hey, Raleigh, I can't bring up my screen right now.
Okay, well,
can you make me the presenter there?
Oh, yeah, I think, all right, yep, that's the issue. All right, you are becoming the presenter now.
Cool. All right, let's do this. So I have called this Culture as Climate, and it's a framework for reading invisible landscapes. And I think it's the beginning of a conversation about how to establish sustainable people systems. The first thing I want to talk about are patterns. These are patterns that you can use to understand a culture that you're being introduced to. All right? And these are guides for helping you to understand how people understand themselves, okay? The first one I want to do is dominant narratives. Dominant narratives are what people tell themselves about themselves, and they portray values and ideals, and it's not important from a cultural perspective whether or not the things that people tell themselves about themselves are historically accurate. It's more that these narratives are set up to teach values, to teach the right way to act within a culture, and to help reinforce these kinds of cultural norms. And it can happen through poetry, it can happen through folk tales, it can happen through, retelling of scripture. It happens, and then it also happens through day-to-day activities. But one type of dominant narrative is an archetype. It's a story we tell about our leaders. So in the United States, one of our dominant narratives is the narrative of the self-made man. And the example that I took for this is Benjamin Franklin. Right now, most Americans know stories about Benjamin Franklin, and we have like all these sayings from him, like a penny saved is a penny earned. And there's a story of how he kind of discovered electricity by attaching a piece of metal to a kite, and then he went and flew it up in a storm, and he got electrocuted by the kite. And there are all these things about Benjamin Franklin, but the values that get extracted from these stories and these quotes are all about thrift, industry, creativity, and individuality. Okay, and the stories we tell about our national heroes in the United States all kind of reinforce a lot of these dominant values that are really powerful in American culture, and have been maintained through the history of the United States, which admittedly is not that long compared to other countries. But that's an archetype derived from narrative that shows the types of values that exist in American culture. Now let's take someone from Arab culture, a gentleman named Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Okay. The way that Americans talk about people like Benjamin Franklin, a lot of Arabs talk about Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. And in fact, I wanted to read a narrative about this guy that was written 4 years ago by a contemporary of ours. And I'm just going to bring that up right now. And I had this up, but now I got to bring it back up again. So here's the story of Salahuddin, and what I want you to do when you listen to this, it's not so much the history, it's not so much the story. Listen to the values that are being emphasized here, because they're not going to be the same as the values you hear when Americans talk about Benjamin Franklin. Okay. And this is only 2 pages, so it should take me 2 minutes. Known in the West as Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, he was born in the year 1137 in Iraq. Famous in the Western history books for his challenge against Richard the Lionheart, he is very seldom portrayed in his true light. He was a man of good build with a bright face, sharp eyes, and a dark beard. He was known for his courage, the strength of his face, and of his faith, and love of reading the Holy Quran. He was also famous for his eloquent speech and the kindness and mercy he had for his people. Although tough with many non-believers, he respected their creeds and allowed them to worship without facing any harm. And many of them held good positions during his era. During Salahuddin's lifetime, the Muslims suffered being disunited and subject to humiliation from anti-Muslim powers. In the coming light, we will shed light on how Salahuddin set about liberating Palestine from crusaders after he had united the Muslim nation under his leadership. In 1169, Salahuddin annexed the states surrounding Palestine and considered it first necessary to unite the Muslims before he faced the Christian kingdoms in the Holy Lands. In 1187, the Christian king of Karak, who was called Arnat, launched an attack against a number of pilgrims traveling to make the Hajj. The attackers, showing no mercy, plundered and tortured men, humiliated women. And while killing the pilgrims, Arnat said, "Go tell Muhammad and ask him if he can save you." This event ended a period of temporary peace that had ensued between Salahuddin and the Christians who were occupying Palestine. Salahuddin, who was always keen on setting free Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque, was now given the opportunity to face the Christians. When this event reached Salahuddin, he tried to overcome his outrage and sent a polite message to King Adnat. In the letter, he asked him to respect the peace agreement, free all the hostages, and to return whatever he had stolen. But the king refused Salahuddin's request, leaving him no other choice but to teach him a good lesson. And then it goes through some of the history that I'm going to skip. It says Salahuddin was always ahead of the Christian armies. He decided to avoid Safavid and attack the His plan was to push the Christians to leave their positions so that they would be tired and exhausted by the difficult journey. In 1187, Salahuddin destroyed Tiberia. Forced into leaving their position, Salahuddin's plan proved its success. The Christians wore bulky armor and heavy weapons, and the intense heat and shortage of water combined with the difficult terrain weakened the soldiers. What was waiting for them? Courageous Muslim fighters willing to sacrifice their life for the sake of the Ummah, which is the Muslim community. On 4th of July, 1187, the Muslim army had surrounded the Christians, and when the heat was unbearable and the fighting reached its climax, Salahuddin ordered his soldiers to set fire to the grass and shrubs surrounding the enemy army. Their suffering complete, Salahuddin inflicted on them a resounding defeat. After this defeat, the Christians amassed a strength of 50,000 fighters to do battle at Hattin. The Christians, led by the kings of Jerusalem, Karak and Tripoli, were again defeated. Many of their princes and knights were taken as prisoners, and it was God's will that Salahuddin should meet face to face with King Arnat of Karak, the butcher of innocent pilgrims. Before killing him with his own hands, Salahuddin told him he was killing him for defaming the honor and dignity of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and for murdering innocent Muslims. After this, Salahuddin opened the castle at Tiberia. Then he moved on to Akka, and on Friday he opened it peacefully. After performing the first Friday prayer, he left the city to his son, and then went north to Sida and Beirut. All of this occurred in 1 month. Before moving on to Jerusalem, he arranged with the well-known Egyptian sailor Hussein ad-Din al-Hajjab to move the Egyptian navy close to Palestine so as to prevent the Christian navy from approaching the coast. On September 19th of 1187, Salahuddin approached Jerusalem and proceeded to lay siege on the city. He had bombarded the city with fire and projectiles until the Christians surrendered. The Muslim army led by Salahuddin entered the city peacefully on Friday the 2nd of October 1187. He put the Islamic flag and took down the large cross from the dome of the rock. Salahuddin expressed in the most practical way the kindness and mercy of Islam when at the peak of his victory and power. He gave freedom to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem to leave the city unharmed. When the Crusaders defeated Jerusalem in 1099, the streets of the city flowed with the blood of 70,000 slaughtered Muslims. After Jerusalem, Salahuddin opened negotiations with the Christians to leave the Islamic lands. Indeed, Salahuddin was both a kind, merciful man and a great warrior. Okay, so that's some history from 900 years ago, and I don't want to exacerbate any kind of West, East, or Christian Muslim antagonism that anybody might feel watching this. But the values portrayed in this story of Salahuddin are very different. Even though he was thrifty and he was creative and he was an amazing individual, which is what we emphasize about Benjamin Franklin, that's not what's emphasized here. What's emphasized here is Salahuddin had amazing prowess and cunning. He was the archetype here is the virtuous warrior priest. The power that he had combined with the restraint that he showed, the hospitality and the grace and the mercy he showed to his enemies as well as to the people that fought with him, his faithfulness and loyalty, his willingness to sacrifice. And these are things that in the tribes that I work with, these are very highly valued ideals. And so these archetypes can help you to understand what type of leadership people want, what type of values people put a high weight on. And the best way to say this is that different cultures favor some universal values above others. All right? There are universal values in all human societies, but they're not all valued at the same level across all cultures and across all societies. Okay? So Benjamin Franklin was a great guy. Well, in some ways he really wasn't a great guy. Salahuddin was also a very inspiring figure. But the stories that we tell about them in our different cultures don't just tell those stories, but they highlight the values that these different cultures have. Now let's talk about George Washington, okay? And I'm picking Bedouin culture and American culture because those are the two cultures that I know best. But this same type of pattern happens throughout. One of the things Americans love about George Washington, aside from him being like the father of the United States, and he helped the United States win the revolution against, Great Britain, and that he was a successful general who faced really terrible odds and overcame them. The thing that Americans really, really love about George Washington is that he could have been king, but he walked away from that power to just be a president. And that he set up the structure that allows for presidents to succeed each other peacefully, even though he could have been king. Now, I have talked with some of the Bedouin that I work with, and they say, you know what, George Washington wasn't smart when he did that. He should have become king because then he could have done a lot more good as a king, because he would have had more power. Because they appreciate very strong and very powerful leaders. That's something that they resonate with in the Bedouin culture that I work in. Okay, so there are very different ways of seeing things, and one way to understand that is through archetypes and dominant narratives. Okay, let's talk about structures of values. And I have these set up as, binaries, where it's one versus the other, but they're really more like strata or like a sliding scale here. These are not black and white. There's white and there's black and there's all the shades of gray in between. Okay. Now these things really, really help me understand where I am when I'm in a foreign culture. One of the most important of these is understanding that there are shame-based societies and guilt-based societies. And the flip side of looking at is an honor-based society versus an integrity-based society. So in a guilt-based society, it is expected that the structures that determine what is good and evil, or the structures that help you decide when to do good, are internal. They're internal structures. In a shame-based society, those structures are external. Okay, so in a shame-based society, and this is most of East Asia, most of North Africa and the Middle East are shame-based societies, where what you do is determined to be good or bad in a large part based on whether or not you have brought shame onto your family or your tribe or your nation or your unit or whatever division of society you're operating in. Have you brought shame on your family, or have you brought honor to your family, or have you brought shame to your ancestors or brought honor to your ancestors? And so that group structure puts in external dictators of whether something was good or bad. Now, when I was in Egypt in 2004 and I became aware of this thing, what it looked to me like was, I said, in this society, everything is determined by whether or not someone else sees you do it. Because if nobody sees you do it, then you haven't brought shame or honor to anything. It's like it didn't happen. And to me, as a Westerner, I thought, a lot of these people have no integrity. And that was my concept of it, and that's what it looks like to people coming from a guilt-based society. And it's not, and that's not true, by the way. There are lots and lots of people in shame-based societies who have a lot of integrity. But the structures of the society are set up so that it is external structures dictating whether actions are good or bad. Okay? Now, in a guilt-based society, someone from a shame-based society looking at a guilt-based society like the United States would say these people have no honor and these people have no shame because they don't care how their actions reflect on their family or on their nation. And of course that's not true as a stereotype, but that is what it appears to someone coming from a shame-based society. Okay, and this is a massive, massive difference in how societies are structured. But this binary shows up all the time, and it's really, really helpful to understand this external structures versus internal structures, and this shame-honor binary versus this guilt-integrity binary, okay? Because it helps you to understand why people are acting the way they are acting. It's because this foundational thing exists, and this split is real, okay? Other type of strata or binaries that tend to be affiliated with these is, do you value individuality, or is there more value placed on the community, right? And this tends to split along that same shame-based versus guilt-based society, and this changes a lot of things. This changes a whole lot of things. I'll tell you one story. I was sitting down with my team of workers, and this is early on in the Baydha project, maybe middle of 2011, and I was trying to have a conversation with 10 to 15 of our workers, and none of them had known me for longer than a year, but I was trying to help make decisions and trying to get people's advice, and nobody would say anything. So I talked to, after we were done and I hadn't really gotten anything done and hadn't gotten any really useful data, I pulled somebody aside and I said, hey, why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you say anything when I was asking these questions? And he said, look, Neal, it's not my place to speak up because there is a senior here, and it's his responsibility and his privilege to speak for the rest of us. And we are only going to speak if he invites our participation. because that is respectful to him and to his station, and that's how our community works. And so the input coming from them, it couldn't happen in that context because I was assuming that these folks operated as individuals, and not that they don't operate as individuals, but their community structure was more important to them than their individual opinions. Okay? So there's this individuality versus community split that also, it affects everything. It affects everything. Some people value freedom much more than they value security. And other people much more value order than they do freedom. And I don't know if we've got any Egyptians watching, but I'm going to give you a stereotype about Egyptians right now who live in Egypt. There's been a lot of stuff going on in Egypt over the last 15 years, and I have spent probably a total of 8 or 9 months in Egypt, and I used to go and speak with people who were shopkeepers, and they would always talk about the glory of old Egypt. And eventually it came to me that what these folks wanted was a pharaoh. That these Egyptians really wanted a pharaoh who would come in and put order to things and restore security, and they didn't mind so much if this pharaoh were to curtail certain liberties as long as there was security and order. And so it's a stereotype to say, but I find that this is confirmed with many, many Egyptians, that there is this longing for that old Egypt and for the glory of the pharaohs, and that has filtered down through the ages to their preferences for what their leaders are. Okay, so they, in my experience, Egyptians have a culture that values order and security more than values freedom. And of course there are exceptions to that. There are exceptions to everything I'm going to tell you today. But within cultures, there are big differences on these types of binaries. And then there are cultures that value tradition much more than they value innovation, and vice versa. Along those lines, there's a certain amount of risk tolerance that is culturally determined along this time of do we want innovation, do we want change, or do we want things to stay as they are? And certainly within every individual society, there are people that fall on both sides of this. But in the desert, let's go back to pre-industrial times. In the desert where I work, as a nomadic person, without access to a lot of trade, without access to a lot of goods produced elsewhere, the austerity, the extremity of the type of climate of a desert does not lend itself to risk-taking, right? That kind of geography lends itself to very strict rules about how you behave, because if you take a risk in the desert and it doesn't go well for you, you die, right? You dehydrate, you get lost, you get bitten by a snake, you get stung by a scorpion, and you're gone. So the geography of the place lends itself to a culture that does not value risk, and to a culture that does not, that highly values tradition and orders and the rules of how you live, because those rules keep you alive in a place like the austere and extreme desert where we work now. So there are all sorts of things that factor into this, but the cultural differences exist, and it's important to recognize that. So here are the implications from those different structures of values. These affect daily interactions. They affect expectations. They affect how you interact with people. They affect how interaction happens within members of the community and between members of the community and members of people who aren't part of the community. And so different structural values require different approaches in how you're going to integrate yourself into a culture or work within a foreign culture. You have to understand the structures of these values because it gives you clues on how you need to operate. Okay. And that's not to say that you do this type of thing hoping to manipulate somebody or hoping to change somebody. That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is that if you don't understand the culture you're in, you're going to fail at whatever you're trying to do. Okay. Let's talk about socioeconomic structures for a little bit. You have cultures that prefer social economics versus market economics. You have cultures that prefer democracy, where people want to vote, and you have cultures where people prefer a monarchy. You have cultures where, you know, things are very tribal versus cultures that are, you know, nation-state oriented versus cultures that are still, you know, based on family groups. And there are all sorts of in-betweens there. But one thing to be aware of is that whatever kind of socioeconomic structure you're in, it tends to fractal across social scales. Okay, so let me give you an example here. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, right? And companies that operate in Saudi Arabia tend to operate as monarchies. And family groups in Saudi Arabia also tend to operate as monarchies. And so it's not just that there's this king that's enforced this monarchy. It's that monarchy is a social fractal that appears in every scale of social organization in this culture. And so how does that play out in daily life? Well, in the United States, when I get up in the morning and I'm with my kids, I ask my kids, what do you want for breakfast? Okay. Whereas when I visit one of my Bedouin families and I'm there for breakfast and I'm with their kids and they say, here's your breakfast. The one in the United States, there are cultural assumptions backed into what do you want for breakfast, because it means that the child has any say. The child has a decision to make, and what he says is going to affect what he gets for breakfast. Whereas with the Bedouin, it's just that, no, this is breakfast, you eat it. Okay, so one, in an American family, that sense of democracy, that sense of consultative decision-making shows up in something as mundane as getting breakfast for your kids, right? And that same monarchical structure that fractals through Saudi society also shows up in something as mundane as breakfast. All right, so when you're looking at a socioeconomic structure, it is often safe to understand that that structure fractals through social scales of organization, and in many cases all the way down to the nuclear family. Okay, and so that can help you to understand both sides of it. It can help you to understand what family dynamics are, but it can also help you if you understand family dynamics, and it can help you to understand dynamics that are further up in the scale. Culture of leadership. This is really important. It's really important for me, but it's also really important in understanding how to approach foreign entities or other organizations, because there are different ways of leadership that people prefer in different cultures, and that leads to different styles of decision making. So the way I grew up where decisions were made as a group, by and large. My parents would seek our input. I have 3 brothers and a sister, and the 7 of us would discuss big family decisions. That's a consultative leadership preference that I grew up with, whereas other people much prefer an autocratic style of leadership. So let me share one more story with you. When I got here, I made a council of 4 or 5 of the Bedou who I trusted and who I had a good relationship with. And I kept trying to involve them in decision making about all sorts of things, because we were setting up structures. We were setting up, okay, we're going to work at this time and go home at this time, and we're going to work this many hours a day, and this is the type of work we should do, and these are the expectations we're going to have. And I was trying to make all these decisions in a way that was tailored to their culture and tailored to certain preferences, but that still allowed us to get things done. And after a month of trying to do this and feeling very frustrated, one of the people on this council, who's an older gentleman, took me aside and he said to me, "Neal, why are you such a weak leader?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Look, you are the manager of this thing. You make the decisions, tell us what we need to do, and we'll follow you." And that was really shocking to me, because in my head and the way that I grew up, good leadership asks for input. And the way that they were seeing me was, they weren't saying, "Oh, this guy wants our input, and isn't that great that we get to participate in decision making." They saw that and said, "This guy doesn't know what he wants to do, and he's a weak leader." And so that was a massive mind shift for me. I mean, I'm so thankful that he did that he took me aside and he laid it out for me the way that they saw it. He said, "Look, you're being a weak leader. We need you to be a stronger leader. Make the decisions. Tell us what you want to do." That's the preferred method of leadership. Okay? So, and I wasn't going to get anything done well as long as you know, that kind of leadership felt icky to me. It didn't feel right to me, because that's not the culture that I came from. That's not how I perceive good leadership, but that's what they wanted, okay? And that's how they perceive good leadership. So if you're going into a foreign culture, you got to understand how decisions get made and how people like decisions to get made and how that happens through leadership. Or else you're going to trip as you get going, as you start out, okay, as I did. Now, there are other kinds of preferences associated with leadership. There's patrimonial leadership, wherein official status is much less important than relationships, okay? And that's called a patrimonial system, where you have somebody in power, and what determines the amount of power you've got is not what your position is, it's how close you are to that person in power. It's your relationship. The relationship is much more important than what you actually are officially. Whereas in other places, you get named to a post, and all of a sudden you have responsibilities and privileges and all these things, and your relationship is not so important with respect to your own job. The amount of power you have comes with your position and not with the relationship that you've got to somebody else, okay? There are elected versus inherited preferences for leadership. There are systems that prefer meritocracies, where your position that you obtain is based on your abilities in theory. Based on your abilities and your capability to take on a certain position. Whereas in other places, the relationship or the nepotistic thing is preferred. That's more important than actual competence. And that doesn't mean that competence is not important. It means that there's something that supersedes it. Okay. And then there are egalitarian styles of leadership, where you've got, and that's tied to the consultative style of decision making, versus tiered systems of leadership, where people really prefer hierarchy and they feel more comfortable in that. Okay. Culture of leadership. You got to know this stuff when you're going into a foreign culture, because it's going to change how you operate. Okay, so I titled this next part, Gaining Influence as an Edge Species. And I consider myself an edge species. In my position where I work with mostly two tribes of nomads in the desert south of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And 6 years ago when I came here, I was the first non-Muslim the people had ever met. I was the first American the people had ever spoken with. And I was totally alien. I was completely alien. Okay? Now, when you are completely alien, there are some serious disadvantages. There are also some serious advantages. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. But that's what I mean when I say gaining influence as an edge species. I'm an edge species. Because I'm not part of the monoculture. I'm not part of the culture at all. So I'm an alien culture. I'm introducing foreign things. That makes me an edge species, okay? And it's at the edges. In ecology, it's at the edges of different ecologies, between the forest and the plain, or between the beach and the sea, or between the river and the ocean. It's on these edges where you get the most flourish of life, where you have the most fertility because of that edge effect. And that also occurs socially as well. If you're in a social monoculture, there's stability there actually, but there's also a lot of definition against the other. And then when an other gets introduced, that monoculture is gone because now you've got an edge species in there. So I want to talk about having these are the 5 things that I have used to integrate myself into the culture I work in now. Okay, the first is the sheikh. Now, sheikh just means tribal leader in Arabic, but this is a picture of a dear man named Sheikh Marzouk, and he is somebody with high social status who is respected in the community, and he is the one who first introduced me to the people in Baydha. He and I drove around Baydha, and we were doing a survey to see how many grazing animals there were in Baydha. But at the same time, he was introducing me to people and saying, this guy's going to come live here, and he is our guest, and he is going to help run this project that's coming from the King Faisal Foundation. And what he did for me was he got my foot in the door, because without him, it would not have been okay for me to be there in any kind of long-term sense. But because of his high social status, because of his connections with the people, and he said, this is our guest, he got my foot in the door. He got my foot in the door, and it would have been impossible without him. Absolutely impossible. And the way to think of this is that he lent me some of his social capital so that I could be in this area and be with these people and have that be okay. Okay? So he's a connected individual who got my foot in the door. And that's really important. So the sheikh, it's really great if you've got a sheikh, and really hard if you don't. Okay? And there's the guide. This man is named Abdurazak Al-Adwani. He was one of the first 4 people that started to work with me. And he is, so he was an early adopter of me and of the project. And this guy is a local, he's a native, and he's been living in Baydha since he was a small child. And he knows everything. He knows all the people there. He knows the right way to behave. He knows all the culture. He knows all the sayings. He knows all the poetry. He knows what's going on in the community. But on top of that, Abdurazak is known throughout the community as a very honest man. A very, very honest man. And to the extent that when he enters into an argument, people believe what he says. But Abdurazak, probably 2 weeks after I had been in Baydha, maybe a month, he invited me to go out into the desert, and we slaughtered a goat together, and we cooked it on a campfire, and we started and he had some other people from the community there. And that was the first time I ate goat brain. It was the first time I ate barbecued lung. And he started to integrate me with other people and to introduce me to people, but also just to show me his way of life. And he decided for some reason that he was going to help me integrate into this culture. And so he has helped me avoid a lot of mistakes. He's also taught me what I call the song. Now, there's another guide I've got as well. It's this young man on the left. His name is Khalid Al-Adwani. He's also a dear friend of mine. Khalid, when I would be invited to go to people's houses, he would always accompany me, and he would say, okay, Neal, when you go into somebody's house, this is what you say. You use this phrase. And then when you start a meal, you use this phrase. And then when you end the meal, you use this phrase. And this is the right way to greet people. If you are family, then you kiss noses. You touch noses together. And if you're friends, you kiss on cheeks this way. And if you're not, then this is how you're supposed to shake hands, or you touch your heart with your hand. He taught me all these little practices that helped other people feel comfortable with me as an other, because I am the other. So having a guide, someone who intimately understands how things operate in this culture, is really crucial. And it's crucial for anybody going into a foreign culture. You need to have a guide, because it's going to help you so much in avoiding pitfalls and in creating real relationships. Okay, so aside from having a guide, I want to talk about the song. Every language is a song, and every culture has its own language. And it's easy for me to talk about this being in a foreign country, what to me is a foreign country, but it even occurs in businesses and in organizations where there are certain key phrases or certain, it goes beyond buzzwords, it's more than buzzwords, but there are these resonant phrases in language that have an immense amount of cultural attachment to them, cultural value to them. Okay, where if you use these phrases, it elevates you in that culture as an other, as an edge species. Singing the song also means talking to the concerns, the problems, the issues that the people you're working with have, rather than trying to make them worry about whatever your issues are, okay, or the things that you think ought to be addressed. That's also singing the song. You've got to sing the song that they're singing because it makes you familiar. It helps remove your own otherness. And it helps you to speak in a way that portrays familiarity as well as concern and love. Because when you learn to sing the song, or rather, let me put it this way, you don't learn to sing the song unless you care. You can't. You can't learn to sing the song unless you genuinely care, because it takes an immense amount of energy and work and effort. All right, so let me give you an example. In Baydha proper, or in Arab culture, it's very customary to use blessings as a way to greet people, as a way when you eat meals. Like there's this common phrase that essentially means bon appetit, right? That you use at the end of a meal. But in Baydha, they don't use that phrase, which sometimes is bilhina wal bil shefa, or they'll say rozikum wa da'amazikum, which essentially they mean bon appetit, okay? But there's this other phrase that only gets used in Baydha. And every time I've introduced it to folks in other parts of the Arab world, they're like, I've never heard this before. It's only Baydha. And they'll say, which means, May God punish your enemies, and if an evil thing is destined for you, may a crappy person be your scapegoat. May it befall a crappy person instead of you, okay? Which is, you know, that sounds foreign. It's going to sound foreign to most of you folks listening to this, but when I use that phrase in Baydha, which, by the way, it's a really wonderful blessing. I mean, that's a nice thing to wish for somebody, right? But when I use that phrase in Baydha, if I'm eating with somebody that hasn't ever met me before, and I use this phrase, immediately, without exception, they will look to the guy who's brought me this, and they say, he knows. They say, he knows. And what does that mean when they say he knows? They mean he knows us. He knows us. He knows our song. And it immediately, it impresses people, first of all, but it makes them more comfortable around me, okay? Because all of a sudden, I'm not so much the other, okay? Singing the song. And that's what singing the song does. It removes otherness. And all of these things are there so that you can establish relationships based on trust. Okay, so here's another way that I'm singing the song. I'm wearing a thobe. I brought my kids to where my friend had his camels, and we milked the camels with my kids, and then drank raw camel's milk, and sat around and ate dates and drank tea, and had a lovely evening. And my kids loved it, and they loved seeing where I work. But the fact that I was wearing a thobe and I was interested in the camels and that I love camel's milk, like all of this stuff removes otherness because it's part of singing the song. Here's another example. We were building our project headquarters and it was hot, so every now and then I'll wear some of the clothes that are very typical to what they wear, and we were sewing goat hair fabric as a shade structure. And so, yeah, I'm doing this very traditional craft with them and wearing traditional clothes, and that makes them feel more comfortable. But this is after 2 years of being with them. If I had done this immediately when I had just shown up, then I would have been a bit of a poser. Honestly, it wouldn't have had the same effect. So there are tiers to this, but singing the song is crucial because that's how you, between those things, between having a sheikh and a guide and singing the song, you can start to develop trust. Okay, and trust is the most important thing when you are operating in another culture. Now, the way that you obtain trust is you act according to the dominant values and accepted roles. Okay, so when I started to be what in their mind was a stronger leader and to be, a little more dictatorial, they felt more comfortable and they started to trust me more by showing interest in their way of life and by actually living the way they lived and by trying to learn their poetry, which is really tough but really cool, and also part of that dominant narrative because poetry is a big deal here. That helped develop more trust. Crucial along this is that you have to be a moral person. You have to be dependable. You have to be competent. You have to be trustworthy. I mean, no one's going to trust you, even if you're singing the song and everything else, if you're not a trustworthy person. And it's also crucial to be sincere, because people know when you're not being sincere. People just get a bad feeling when you're not being sincere. You have to actually be an ethical and moral person, okay? And then finally, you have to get rid of fear. You have to get rid of that otherness through familiarity, which is gained by proxy of the sheikh and having a guide and singing the song, okay? That is how you start to develop trust. Now, once you have trust, then you can actually start to work on issues, on real issues. Because when people trust you and see that you are competent, then they will start to open up and start to involve you in this culture, okay? So let's talk. I want to share just a few stories with you about me going through this process. This is my dear friend Khamis. Khamis is my deputy now. When we first started out, this is a picture of him with a water level. We were laying out contours on our demonstration site using a water level, and then we used rows of stones to kind of lay out that contour. But Khamis is a devout older man who has some standing in El Baydha. He's a respected person because he's smart and he's a good worker, and he represents a lot of those traditional Bedouin values, where he is courageous and he is strong and he shows good leadership. And he was one of the first people that started working with me. And he, after 4 to 6 months of working, I think he decided that I was okay. And then he started to bring other people from the community into the project. He started to involve other people and say, okay, this American guy is all right. The work we're doing is all right. And we need to get more people involved. And that happened because over that first half a year, he learned that he could trust me and learned that the work we were doing was going to be beneficial to him and his community. So he aside from him now, 3 of his sons work with us. And a lot of nieces and nephews and people who are married into his family, because once that trust was achieved, he said, okay, this is something that I want my family involved in. All right. Now here's a story about Ayed. Ayed is younger, and he, well, now he's about 28, but when we started off, he was in his early 20s. And Ayed and his father were the first people to invite me to where they actually lived for dinner. And they lived about an hour drive off of the main road. So we'd leave the road, drive into what seemed like the middle of nowhere. I had no idea how to get there or how to get out. And we would go to their house in the evenings and eat a very simple dinner together and talk. It would be me and Ayed and its father Munir and Khalid, who I showed you before, and Abdulrazak. And we would sit and talk, and I would practice my Arabic with them because I was speaking a different dialect initially. But there was one night, and they were so gracious and so hospitable, as they are, because hospitality is a major, major value in Bedouin culture. There was one night where we ate a dish that was like old bread soaked in milk and sweetened, and you eat out of one pot. So we were all dipping our hands into this milky, wet bread, and then we would, because we were eating with our hands, we eat with our hands out there, and everybody washes their hands before we eat. But this pot was like wet, and there was soaking bread in it, and it tasted fine. But when you're eating this kind of drippy stuff with your hands, like everybody's putting it in their mouth and getting their tongues on their fingers and dipping back into this communal pot. And I ate it, and I didn't complain. I didn't say anything. I was like, okay, I can manage this. I can do this. But then the next day, I was at work. I was speaking with one of our workers, and he said, hey, where were you last night? And I said, oh, I was at Ayed's house with his dad. And he said, oh, what'd you eat? And I said, well, we ate this thing. And he said, oh, you know what? I don't really like that. And there's another Bedouin guy, and he was like, I don't really like that dish. And I responded, yeah, I said it was a little gross. And then when I turned around, I saw that Ayed's dad had been listening in on our conversation. I didn't know he was there, but he overheard me say that this thing that he had given me was kind of gross. And I have not been invited back to his house in the last 5 years. This very gracious and hospitable and poor man who had me at his house overheard me say this thing, and it killed any kind of future relationship. Now, Ayad and his father both still work with us, and I visit Ayad frequently. But I don't think his father ever told him about that. I think he just kept it to himself. But because I didn't watch my tongue, I killed that relationship over what ultimately was a very, very small thing. And I regret that I regret that a great deal. I regret it a great deal. Because he was very hospitable and very gracious at a time when other people were not interested in getting to know me. And so you have to watch your mouth. You have to think before you speak and before you act when you are the other trying to integrate into a foreign culture. Okay, that's one of my mistakes, one of my big ones. This is a picture of how we used to eat lunch when we were first starting out. We'd work starting at 10 a.m. We'd go until 6 p.m. But we provided lunch for these guys, and so we would sit under this tree and eat lunch. And one of the first days, this was after we had expanded our team to about 15 people, and I was the one who would drive out and bring lunch. And there was one of the first days. I spread everything out so that because you sit in a circle and everybody eats off of the same kind of spread. So I sat down next to Khamis and next to this other guy at one of these spreads, and this other guy and we hadn't known each other for more than a few days. After I sat down, he stood up. And he said, I'm not going to eat with an unbeliever. He said, I'm not going to do it. And it hurt me. It hurt me a great deal. Because to me, I was, first of all, I was paying for this meal, and I was bringing this, and I was trying to, in my head, I'm like, look, I'm here to try to help folks. But to him, I was still a threat. I didn't have that trust yet. He didn't know who I was. He just knew that I was an other, and he didn't feel safe with that. And so he said, I'm not going to eat with this guy. So he stood up and went somewhere else. And it made me angry. I was angry about it, and I could have fired him. I had all the power to do that, and instead, I didn't do anything, and I went home and I thought it through, and I talked about it with a friend of mine who is an Egyptian, and this person said to me, look, he doesn't feel secure, and you have to put yourself in his shoes and figure out where he's coming from. Don't take it personally. It's not about you. It's about the fact that you're introducing all these strange things, and he doesn't feel secure. So I thought that through, and I forgave him. And he's been with the project ever since. He's been with us for 6 years. He's a great worker, and we have a great relationship at this point. We talk on the phone sometimes, and he's responsible. And that trust is there now. But for me personally, I had to endure I had to have a thick skin to go through that process, and that's crucial. You can't take yourself too seriously in this type of thing when you're the other. And you can't take it personally when people treat you that way, because that's how things go until you reach that level that you have people's trust. All right. once you have trust and you understand the culture you're working in, then you can start to deal with the pain. And the pain is just how I refer to, whatever problems are affecting the community. No one is going to take your advice. No one's going to listen to you until you have that trust. But once you do, if you can demonstrate a solution to problems that are affecting the entire community, you change from being this guy that's trusted to being somebody who can become a leader. Because if you can take pain away from people, your status becomes so much more elevated. But you can't do that until you have their trust, because otherwise it's suspect. So the pain that we've been addressing is, or that I've been addressing with my work, specifically has to do with developing a rural economy in this area. And because I have trust, I've been able to have up to, 100 people working with us and following my orders, because people that they trust me. And so even though we have done things that were completely foreign to them, we have built dams on a mountain in the middle of the desert, right? And when I first said, hey, we're going to start building these dams out of rocks, they're like, this is a crazy thing. This is a really crazy thing. And at the beginning, the only reason that most of them stuck with me was because we were able to pay them a salary at the end of the month. And I've got no problem admitting to that. But as time went on and they started to see that what we were doing was working and was affecting how water and floods flowed, then they said, okay, yeah, this is a good idea. This guy isn't so bad. His ideas are actually kind of working. And with every step we have taken in, the earth bag building we've done, in the building a bat house where we're collecting, or we're going to collect bat guano as an agricultural soil amendment, and at the same time we're reducing mosquito and fly populations through this bat house. But when I said, hey, we're going to build a bat house, and they're like, okay, well, this seems pretty crazy, but Neal has done other crazy things that worked with us. So that trust develops. Solving that pain, it's this self-reinforcing feedback loop where your status and your ability to gain trust and your ability to help influence expands, okay? Because you have that trust and you are addressing pain and taking pain away from people, okay? That's the pain. That's the final step before you start all over with this thing. Now, to give you another example, there is a really thorny issue that we are working on that deals with land management, where we're trying to work with various figures in the community to try to reestablish a land ownership system that allows people to manage the land they're on legally, which kind of exists right now but doesn't really. And once we are able to, if we are able to solve that pain, it is going to, this one issue is a major node. It's a major social key point, where if we can fix that pain, it is going to result in so much more prosperity and so much more ability for people to develop their land. And if we can also address that, it's going to result in a massive expansion of the project and the systems we're building. Because we'll be able to address what is a major pain for a lot of people. So that's when you are moving into a foreign culture or operating in a foreign culture in a kind of organization that you don't understand. It is really, really helpful to have a sheikh, someone with high social capital who's willing to lend it to you, to get your foot in the door, to have a guide, someone who's going to show you the ropes, help you avoid pitfalls, help you understand the right way to act and the right way to speak and how to sing the song. And then once you start singing that song, you can start to obtain people's trust as long as you are trustworthy. And once you reach that stage, then you can start to address pain. And if you do that, you can't just say, hey, folks, you're doing this wrong. You need to do it this way. No one's going to listen to you. You've got to demonstrate it. You've got to demonstrate it and show people how it's done and provide the kind of context for them to implement it. And once that occurs, then you end up in a place where you are perceived as someone who's trustworthy, someone who is a problem solver. Then you start to take on leadership roles. People can start to see you as a leader, even though you used to be an other. And that is how you start to manage social change as an edge species. Okay? I want to talk just a little bit about Zone Zero. Zone Zero, in permaculture speak, is the mind. It's how you're doing yourself on the inside. Anytime you're doing this kind of thing, you have to deal with frustration. You have to deal with loneliness. You have to deal with insults. You have to deal with being misunderstood. You have to deal with risk and sometimes danger. And how you are on the inside is going to dramatically influence your ability to handle that kind of thing. Culture shock is a real thing, and it happens. It doesn't just happen when you go into another country. This is a picture of me and my son when we went to Petra, and he's 3, and we hiked a lot, and he burned out. Burnout is real, and if you're not prepared for it, it's tremendously hard to deal with. But if you have a support structure that allows you to relax a bit when you burn out, a support structure that can carry you the way I hiked around with my son on my back, then burnout's okay. You can deal with it if you've got the support structures you need. If you don't have those support structures, you're going to burn out and it's going to collapse. Okay, it's not going to work. And the final thing I want to talk about is understanding Zone Zero and other people. I'm calling these Spackmanisms. Actually, somebody else called this, and I was flattered by it, so I'm keeping it. Okay, hope you don't mind. Behavior isn't going to change. People don't change behavior. They don't change management systems, and cultures don't change in a positive way unless people feel safe, both in the transition and in the result. People have to feel safe. When you're an other, people don't feel safe, okay? And that otherizing process is a defensive mechanism, okay? When we see people as other, that's a defensive mechanism for us because we perceive that there might be a threat. It's kind of a lizard brain kind of response that we have unintentionally, or intentionally sometimes, but we otherize people as a defensive mechanism, whether to preserve our own worldview or to protect ourselves against perceived threats, okay? Ultimately, what drives behavior are culture, psychology, and incentives. So a quick story here. When I first was recruiting a team of workers in El Baydha with Sheikh Marzouk, who accompanied me and introduced me to people, we initially had 15 people come. And on that first day that these 15 guys showed up, I explained in what was very poor Arabic kind of the big picture of harvesting floods to make the land more productive so that we could have goods to sell and create an economy. And that first day after I explained that, I said, okay, so what we have to do is a water management system, and we're going to hike up the mountain and start building a dam. And as we started up the mountain, one of these guys was kind of right behind me and in front. He sat down, and I turned around, and everybody else sat down with him. And bear in mind, nobody knows who I am. I don't have any trust yet. There's no relationship. I just have my foot in the door because of Sheikh Marzouk. And this guy in front said, this is going to be really hard work, isn't it? And I said, yeah, it's going to be hard work. And he said, you know, I don't think I'm really interested in that. And he got up and turned around and walked away. And everybody else, except for 4 people, walked away with him. 4 guys stayed, and then we were down to me and 4 guys. And so I said, okay, here, this is our start. We're starting off with these 4. After a couple of weeks with those initial 4 guys, all of whom are still with us on the project and who are leaders in our project now, I said, okay, guys, look, we need more people to come and work with us. So I will give you a bonus. If you recruit somebody to come work with us, I'll give you, you know, a sum of money once they show up and another sum of money after they've been with us for 6 months. Okay? And within a week, we were back up to 15, 20 guys working. Okay? Just because the incentive was there. Setting up incentives to get the right incentives in place is crucial in establishing the kind of behavior that you need to see. And to the extent that there are counter incentives or incentives driving the kind of behavior that is not productive, those are very, very hard to overcome. So incentives are a big driver of behavior. Psychology and culture are the other big driver of behavior. They kind of set the context and the framework for how we behave. And then incentives play a very big deal in that. Denouncing aspects of culture never yields positive results. It never yields positive results. And I'm just going to leave it at that. To the extent that there are things in an organization or in family or in things where you want to kind of help facilitate changes in behavior or changes in culture, denouncing never works. It never works. Even if there are things that you really dislike, even if there are things that you disagree with, even if there are things that you think are not acceptable, let's say, denouncing never yields positive results. It never does. And what you think should be, or how you think things should be, or how people should act, is irrelevant. Should is irrelevant in any kind of cultural engineering, in any kind of managing cultural change, or establishing culture. In, like, if you own a business and you run that business, the way you act sets the culture for your business, and your employees or the people that work with you are all going to key in on that. Okay? Should is irrelevant. Familiarity precedes trust. People aren't going to trust you unless they become familiar with you, or at least feel like you fit into some kind of other archetypes that they're familiar with. And you cannot lead cultural change without that trust. Familiarity precedes trust, and trust precedes accepted leadership. And finally, none of this really works without love. It really doesn't. People respond to love. They do not respond well to manipulation. They do not respond well to people who are in it to make money or who are in it just for themselves. People don't respond well to that. People respond to love. And you cannot love others unless you love yourself first. So zone zero stuff is crucial. It's crucial for you. It's crucial to the extent that you're leading change in culture, or trying to help solve problems, or trying to create changes in structures, or in businesses, or in organizations, or in counties, or whatever you have. Zone zero is crucial, as is the rest of this framework. But this is my framework for understanding foreign culture, the structures of values. the archetypes, the dominant narratives. All these things help us to understand how people value or how people weigh different values, how people are expected to act within a certain culture, and explanations for actions that you don't get at first all come from this framework. They help immensely. And then having a guide, having a sheikh, singing the song are all really, really important. And that's how I do it. That's how I've done it the last 6 years. It's how I did it when I lived in Guatemala. If I'm ever in some other place, it's going to be the same thing. And there you have it. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for coming to Sustainable Design Masterclass. And now we will get to some questions.
Thanks, Neal. That was, again, super fantastic. Really appreciate that presentation. Especially for, in my case, I know adapting different culture coming from California, like urban Oakland, to even to Iowa, Midwest, to Montana, it's just different values, and you got to speak a different language. And there's kind of, you know, different levels of trust that you got to create. So yeah, if you have any questions, ask them right now, and we'll get to them, just starting from the top down to the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Fernando. I'm glad you liked this one.
Okay, so Lucia, do you work with any women at all? How do you navigate that issue?
Lucia, I don't work with any women, at least not in Baydha, not with the community. I have in exceptional circumstances. There have been a few years where I was in charge of distributing goods that were donated as part of Ramadan. In Ramadan, Muslims give alms to the poor. They give goods and food and gifts and cash. And so I had a role in distributing those goods to people in Baydha. And when I have had that responsibility, I have interacted with a number of widows in our community. There are people on this project working with the women on a variety of different issues, but I'm not involved in those projects except in a consultative role. Sometimes they ask me for advice, or they want to know who somebody's married to or who somebody's related to and how they fit into the community. So not on a personal level, no, but there are other people in this project working with the women. Okay? Do you think you can sing the song if you don't speak the language? No, you can't. You can't sing the song if you don't know the language. But even trying to learn the language is singing the song, okay? I speak Spanish and I speak Arabic, and I have spent extensive amounts of time in Guatemala and in Jordan and in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt. And everywhere I have gone, and even to the extent where I've spoken Spanish with people from Argentina or from Spain, people always appreciate just that you're trying to learn their language, and just the fact that you're trying to learn the song almost counts like singing the song. It's not the same though. Singing the song means you know. Learning the language means you're trying. Okay? Kate, I'm really glad that you think this is relevant. Actually, to all of you folks who are saying thank you and that this is good information, I really appreciate your attendance. I really think there's so much contention and so much assertion that that the way we interact with people all has to follow the same model, and I think that's a mistake. I think it's a big mistake to assume that everybody else is like me, and so the way that I want to be treated, the way that I want to interact, is how other people want to interact and how other people want to be treated. I mean, that's the golden rule, right? And that bears out across cultures with respect to respecting people. But in terms of how do people want to be led, how do people want decisions to be made, how do people feel relaxed around you as an other, that stuff has to be tailored to local conditions. Just the same as, like, you wouldn't put an agricultural system in Brazil, you wouldn't take that and try to plug it into you know, a Dehesa in Spain. In ecology, it's so self-evident that our designs have to be tailored to the climate and the geography and all those other aspects of place. But very, very few people understand that we can do that same thing with people systems. And I think understanding culture is the same as understanding those natural patterns. Or not those natural patterns, those people patterns, cultural structures, those invisible patterns. If we understand those, then we can create people systems that are going to last and that people feel comfortable in. Okay? Marcus says, how long did it take until I had created trust? With some of the early adopters who were willing to take a shot on me, and you're always going to have early adopters and late adopters, right? Some people are more willing to open up to you than others in the community will be. The first people that trusted me were, we all still here? Raleigh, you still hear me? Okay. The first people that trusted me, I think it took 3 months before they really trusted me as a person. Now, whether or not they trusted that I knew what I was doing, I think that took 1.5 years. But then the community as a whole, there are still people who don't really trust me. It's a community of 4,000 people, so there's no way they're ever all going to know me personally. But I think the majority understand that, or believe that I'm a trustworthy person, and believe that we are doing good, and not there to take advantage of them, not there to try to, to aggrandize ourselves. That probably took 2.5 years before they believed I knew what I was doing, and they believed that it was going to work, and they trusted that that they were there for the right reason, or at least that I was there for the right reason. All right, next question. I can't click on it. Yeah,
Marcus,
can you read the one from Ray?
Sure. Marcus. Ray. Okay, yeah. We'll do Ray then Marcus, but Ray's like, any thoughts on when the group is somewhat familiar with the other? In other words, ideas about the person, whether that might help or hinder the process of building trust.
Well, it depends on the stereotype that people apply to you, Marcus. Because you are going to walk in and people are just going to have assumptions about you. And if you know what those assumptions are, you can use that. If you don't know what those assumptions are, then you got to figure it out, right? So for instance, when I first came to Baydha, like the very first couple of days, the first question people asked me was, where are you from? The second question people asked me was, are you a Muslim? The third question was, why aren't you a Muslim? And the fourth question was, do you know The Rock and John Cena? Okay? Because a lot of what the Bedouin know about America, aside from like who our presidents are, is they love WWE, and most of them watch it. So they were all talking to me about John Cena and Big Show and The Rock, and I don't watch any of that stuff. And in fact, they were really disappointed. They were really disappointed. Like they were like, oh, we get to meet this American, and maybe he knows John Cena, and then they're like, no, he doesn't. So that kind of sucks. All right. So yeah, people are going to have all kinds of assumptions about you. To the extent that you can correlate with the positive assumptions and negate the negative ones, that's where I would start out. Okay, does that help, Ray?
Oh man, good lesson to Saudi Arabia. You gotta get up on your WWE, your
I know,
Undertaker,
isn't that
Stone Cold
great?
Steve Austin,
Well, Steve
John
Austin, they
Cena.
all,
Oh my God.
that's
Okay,
what that's
so
what they associate with Americans.
yeah, I mean it's super goofy. That's funny, but I guess that's super American and it's hilarious. But yeah, Hulk
Yeah.
Hogan, representative of America. I mean Jesse Ventura was governor, so
See,
makes
and
sense.
most of these guys don't know the older folks. They just know the newer ones.
Yeah,
Because they're like 20 to 30 years old, the guys who know these guys.
yeah. Good stuff. Well, okay, so Ray asks, Marcus is asking, how long did it take to actually create the trust? And looking back from now, what is the one big thing you would have done differently if you could have started over?
Okay, so I talked about the trust already. The one big thing I would do differently if I could start over. In this aspect, I differently in this aspect. It's a process that inevitably comes with mistakes. I wish I had spoken better Arabic when I started, or at least that I understood local Arabic. I wish that I had. I wish that I'd had a better support team starting off. Because when I first came here, my wife and my kids were back in the U.S. and I was here, and we were apart for 4 or 5 months, and that was tremendously difficult. And I went through some profoundly lonely times, and that's very, very tough. So I wish I'd had better personal support. Not because the Bedouin were ever inhospitable or mean, or none of that ever occurred. In part because I established myself as a guest through the sheikh. And in Bedouin culture, when someone is a guest, there are all these required acts that have to kick in, all these required behaviors that have to kick in when you're dealing with a guest. So the fact that I established myself as a guest was a crucial early step. And the people have been really wonderful with me, by and large. I have never felt unsafe, never felt physically unsafe. But I do wish I had had better personal support for myself. I did not have a mentor. With respect to this kind of stuff, and this framework that I've just given you is something that I came up with 2 years ago and that I've refined since. But it was me looking back and saying, okay, how did I actually do this? So that's what I wish I'd had starting over. Okay.
That's good stuff. So shout out to Gabriel. Thanks. He's saying it's encapsulating the exact experience he's had living in China for 35 years and running a company. Yeah, I can imagine from America to China, such a different cultural plunge.
Yep. Well, good. But that's gratifying. Who's saying this? Gabriel?
Yeah, Gabriel Harris.
Thanks, Gabriel, for saying that. It's really gratifying to me to see that this is resonating with other folks who have been expatriates in foreign cultures. That's actually because, like I said, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not a sociologist. So it's good to hear that. Thank you very much.
Cool. So Juan asks, he'd like to know your vision for the future of the region, agroforestry wise.
Juan, if this is the first webinar you're seeing, can I recommend that you purchase the first 2 webinars? as soon as we get them up. I don't want to. I'm not a salesman, but there's 3 hours of webinar material directly about that question. All right, that's what I'm going to say. But yes, our vision for this area is we aim to turn this desert into a massive silvopasture system with massive ecological services being played out that aren't currently. All right.
Yeah, we got 2 presentations on terraforming, part 1 and part 2. We'll send those to you as soon as we get that page up. And man, shout out to Jeremiah Martin. He's working with the Quivira Coalition in Mexico. He's saying this is going to help him integrate into the Spanish and Native American cultures in New Mexico. That's great, man. Like, your work is awesome. You work with Bill Zedike and Craig Spanholz. It's incredible. Thanks for showing up. So Lucia asks, do you feel like having a different culture at home lessens your value as a leader in the eyes of the locals? She's referring to your family or your Western family structure.
No, I don't feel that way. But because the way that the Bedouin have never been in my home, even the architecture of our home would make them feel uncomfortable because their homes are designed to separate the sexes for when guests come. Whereas in the West, or at least in the United States, we much prefer open architecture where you can see from room to room. Yeah, the architecture of our house would be foreign to them. But the way my behavior, I have learned to tailor my behavior to what they perceive as good leadership. Not perfectly, but better than when I started out. But also, I'm LDS, I'm a Mormon, and so to the extent that the health code in the Mormon faith and in the Muslim faith are very similar, they feel that I'm a very respectable person, even though I don't share their faith, because I don't drink and I don't smoke, and the way that I behave, the way that I act, that's in line with my own faith, correlates with their ideas of what a respectable person is or who an honorable person is. So no, that does not lessen my value as a leader in the eyes of the locals. But it has taken me years to get to that point where people see me as a leader. Okay, and not everybody sees me that way.
Cool. So Gabriel's asking about the eating the wet bread at the house. Oh no, this is about the guy that wouldn't eat you because you were not Muslim. He says, was the not eating with the unbeliever episode possibly due to the fear of contamination, like the issue?
No.
And okay.
No, that's not where. No, not at all. It was because he felt uncomfortable with somebody is a fairly intimate thing. I mean, it's a significant thing. There's a phrase in Arab culture that's khubz wa milh, which means bread and salt. But if you have shared bread and salt with somebody, then there's a bond there. And so he did not want to have that bond with me because he did not feel comfortable. So, and no, it didn't have to do with that. That's not how I see it.
And Jamie asks, replay available? Yeah, we'll send it out. It'll be free till Sunday, and then we'll get the part 1, 2, 3 up for purchase later.
Yeah.
And Karen thinks, do you think that trust and acceptance is interchangeable? Ooh, interesting.
Hi, Karen. No, I don't think so. Because there are plenty of people in society that are accepted who aren't trustworthy. In a tribe, for instance, there are a few particular members of our community in El Baydha where people are accepted as a part of the tribe and as a part of the community, but they are not trusted. People don't trust them, and rightly so, I believe. So no, I don't think those are interchangeable.
Yeah, it seems like Gabriel had a good follow-up question to that. He was like, what was the land ownership structures that existed with the Bedouin? Was that owned by tribes for the Saudis, or how was that?
There was a traditional land management system that existed all across the Arabian Peninsula before the 1950s. And that was based on tribal management on tribal boundaries. And those boundaries were not always fixed, right? Because there are all kinds of poems about wars between tribes, old poems that show some of these archetypes I've talked about and really highlight the values that the Bedouin put a lot of weight on. But that system ended in the 1950s, and since then it's been this big gray area because the population expands. People are building houses on land that traditionally belong to the tribe, but legally they do not own. And it's a very, very thorny issue that we're hoping to help create a solution to that is not just relevant in Al Baydha. Okay, who's next?
Uta just says he wants to thank us because he's a suburban German that moved to rural Ireland 25 years ago. He says that's kind of the exact same experience he's dealing with.
The land ownership?
Oh, well, like not the land ownership, just the cultural integration, from Germany to rural Ireland. And
oh, yeah.
I'm sure the same thing is going from if you lived in Oakland your whole life and you move out to rural, rural Tennessee, way different values, and it's just going to be a different language. Let's say you're trying to bridge the gap between taking on an issue that deals with climate change with a farmer who may not even believe it exists. How do you bridge that gap? How do you appeal to the same cultural values if you want the same thing?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, sure. I'd love you to speak with that, because that's like, how do you, let's say, appeal to someone who's in the Rust Belt, and you both want ecosystem regeneration, but let's say they don't believe in climate change. They don't value.
Well,
that may not be their first.
Okay, I will share this with you folks right now.
Yeah.
I never talk about climate change. At least in Saudi Arabia, and typically I almost never talk about it, because there's a way to solve climate change without ever talking about it. If you go to a farmer and you're like, hey, your farming is really destructive and your cows are farting too much, and that's going to melt the ice caps, that farmer's just going to laugh in your face, and he's never going to talk to you again, right? You're singing the wrong song. But if you go to a farmer and you say, hey, you're losing a lot of soil, your fertility is dropping, you're not going to be able to produce as much. If he trusts you, likelihood is he's going to admit, yeah, that's an issue, and I've been reading about no-till, and I've been reading about, absorption belts and shelter belts and all this type of stuff, but I don't know what to do with it. And you say, well, look, there are ways that we can increase the fertility of your land and stop all this runoff and help retain more water, and this is going to reduce your expenses and help you to produce more. Okay? You're talking his language now because you're talking about first his bottom line. Okay? So many farms fail. So if you're not talking about finances, that's the pain, right? You got to talk about the pain. Can you solve that pain in a way that contributes to solutions on climate change? Absolutely. So why talk about climate change at all? There's no point. Solve the pain in a way that solves the problem you care about, because then you're hitting two birds with one stone.
That's a good answer. I think a lot of us coming from like, say West Coast or from an environmental background where that's what we care about. That's one way that we're really gonna have to move forward.
I think it's dumb to talk about climate change with farmers.
Yeah. Yep.
Why would you do that? You're gonna shoot yourself in the foot before you even get to anything.
Yeah, totally. A follow-up question. Fernando says, what was the non-believer issue? Did that get overcame with time?
Yeah, of course it did. Because people realize that I'm a moral person, and that I'm, in their terms, they came to realize that despite me being the other, that I was still safe. Okay. The threat that I presented when I was first introduced, and it's not that I was actually threatening anybody, right? It's that otherness is there as a defensive mechanism, right? And you have to show that you are not a threat and that you are safe. And you can't just show up and say, "Hey, I'm not a threat. You can trust me," right? That's not how it works. You have to live a moral life and be a dependable and trustworthy and caring person. And once people understood once they understood that I was safe, then they could start to interact. Okay. Who's next?
Oh, okay. Well, Eric just has a funny observation. Well, one, he's like, he wants the info to the hymna. You can find that. Maybe.
Oh, yeah, we
So,
never sent that out. We never sent that out, Eric. Let's make a note. Let me just make a note about that, Eric, that I need to send you guys hymna stuff.
yeah, or just email us. We'll get right back to you with that info,
Yeah.
and we'll forward it.
Send us an email.
Yeah, and he said that Trump was on a wrestling show. Yeah, he got stunned by Stone Cold Steve Austin. It was a fascinating night in American history. So HD, hey, good to see you. She says, when disputes and disagreements happen, do you defer that to tribal leaders? Say disputes on your team.
That depends. It depends. What does it depend on? It depends on if I think I can handle it without him.
Fair enough. Okay. Lucia, looks like we're getting to the end of the questions, but Lucia asks, have you worked with Bedouin traditional government structures? Are you planning to integrate them into management of the final system, like the nomadic structures?
Yeah, they're already managing. Last year I had 8 teams of workers, and each one of those teams had a local leader and a local deputy, and those guys reported back to me. We do have how do I put this? We have structures in place that's going to make sure that these people are running the show before I leave. All right, at least to a lot of it, not all, but a lot. Okay, and the first question was what? That was the second question. Have I worked with Bedouin traditional government structures? That's just tribalism. Yeah, I work. Tribalism is the context for the Bedouin culture. So yeah, tribalism is a big part of how I perceive the social interactions. Okay.
Cool. Okay, so Marcus, I think this is a very important question. Like, how did you integrate your family into Saudi Arabia? And he says, did they surf or live off the trust you managed to establish or did they face issues when they're arriving there?
When my family moved here, I stopped living in Al Baydha, and we have a place in Jeddah, which is close to where my kids go to school. And so my family is not integrated into tribe. My family is not integrated into Al Baydha. They have their own place where they feel very comfortable and where they have friends and where they don't have to deal so much with they don't have to deal so much with their own sets of other all the time. So they're not integrated into the tribe. They're not integrated into Al Baydha. It's taken a lot of effort. I mean, they certainly went through culture shock when we moved to Jeddah, and there is a process for dealing with that, but we're not going to go into that right now. That's a different presentation. How to deal with culture shock.
Yeah. Okay, so I think this is the last question, unless somebody else. Okay, so Karen asks, what methods of mediation or conflict resolution or negotiation would you employ in issues as contentious as land ownership disputes?
Oh, I don't deal with those.
Okay.
No, when there's a land dispute, we send people to the local magistrate because that's his job, and I'm never going to deal with that where like some guy's like, this is my land, and another guy says, no, it's my land. I'm not getting in the middle of that. No. Because that's not project stuff, and that's so far outside of my role, so far outside of my scope of responsibility, and I would never want to do that, and they would not want me to do that. That's something that the tribal leader does, the sheikh does, in conjunction with the local magistrate. All right, but that does, I mean, that kind of sidesteps the question. What mediation or negotiation do I, when I am mediating or negotiating, there's a technique called pace and lead that we don't have time to explain right now. You can look it up. And mostly when people are angry and in a dispute, the first thing they want is they want to be listened to. They want to know that somebody cares about what they have to say. And after that, they want to know that there's going to be some kind of fair deal. And usually when I do get caught up in this kind of thing with the Bedouin, because it's work-related, I will pull two guys who know the people in a fight, who know the context, who know the history, and I will delegate that to one of them. Usually almost always it's my deputy Khamis, because he is respected, because he has status, and because people expect him to be fair. But if one of the people in a dispute is related to Khamis, then I give it to somebody else.
Okay, so I think this is the last question from Gabriel. Very last question. So is setting up the idea of commerce and trading, is that something alien to the Bedouin as a practice? And how are they going to adjust to the practice of, let's say, managing that business and selling products? What are going to be the difficulties of running a rural economy there?
That's going to be easy. Trading is in these guys' blood. I mean, for hundreds of years, this was the spice route from Yemen and India up to Europe. Incense, oils, spices. Before trade ships were going around the Horn of Africa, they were coming through here. From India, across the sea into Yemen, and then from Yemen up this coast. Trading is how these people lived for a long, long time. All of these guys are natural salesmen, natural negotiators. That's never going to be a problem. They're naturals at that. That's not going to be hard. In fact, what we're doing plays to those strengths. And to the extent that you can, you always want to play to the cultural strengths of the people you're with.
Nice. Good stuff. All right. I think that's good. Lucia just says thank you. As a translator, she says, I can tell you that singing the song is crucial, and the fastest way to do that is body language and appropriate dress. She loves her work and wishes you the best of luck. Awesome.
All right, let's cut the recording.
All right, yep, cutting the recording. Thanks everybody for sticking in to the end. You spent 2 hours of your time learning about how to bridge cultural barriers and get cultural frameworks going, and I appreciate that you stuck around with us. I appreciate all of you showing up and hearing back from you. It's fantastic. We're going to send the replay out to you right after this. You're going to get it for free till Sunday night, and then we're going to sell all the 3-part series as the Terraforming series. And we've got what do you call it?
The Spackage.
The Spackage. The 3-part Spackage available for $9.95. That'll be great. Yeah, 2 more dryland webinars coming up. It's going to be great. 2 dryland farmers. Neal, how about you give a little bit of background on these guys?
Next week we have a guy who's doing really neat work in Uganda, kind of similar to me in that he's a Canadian bloke who's been in Uganda, and they're doing moringa farming, but they're further along in the process, in part because they've got way better weather than we do. But that's next week, is dryland moringa farming in Uganda. And then the week after that, we've got Nick and Maria Netien from Cyprus. They just won the world record for the olive oil with the most phenol. I don't remember the most what, but it's like the healthiest olive oil in the world. They have the world record, and they're doing an olive carob polyculture. And they did their PDC with me back in 2010. So really excited to have those folks on as well.
Yeah, that'll be cool. Well, all right, we're going to stop the recording right now for everybody who's going to watch the replay. Thanks for sticking around. So.